So it's more gray. It's a bit like the Cold War back in the Soviet era with, the fear of nuclear strikes. Well, now it's not nuclear strikes and it's not cold. Now it's gray and now it's cyber attacks, attacks on hospitals, on utilities, and so on.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Carrie Walker with ZAG Communications. And with us today, we have Mark Sangster, Vice President and Industry Security Strategist at eSentire. He's also the author of a new book out, No Safe Harbor, The Inside Truth About Cybercrime and How to Protect Your Business. Here today, we're going to talk a little bit about cyber attacks and provide some insight as to why cyber criminals continue to breach defenses of organizations globally. Thank you for joining us, Mark.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you, Carrie.
Let's just dive right in. First, can you explain why businesses continue to fall prey to cyber attackers? You've often talked about creating a safe space. So how is that done in today's environment? What should businesses do?
Yeah, absolutely. The problem is that business leaders think that, they're a little business in the Midwest, that they don't have anything worth stealing. And how would some criminal in Russia or China or North Korea even know they exist? The problem is that cyber criminals don't discriminate by employee count or revenue or brand or your location in an NFL city, right? Through a long process of socialization, criminals have learned who pays the ransoms and what data is worth stealing. And when companies don't see themselves as the target, they don't invest in cyber protection and are exposed to cybercrime. And that's really the purpose of the book, is to open up that dialogue and that conversation, to move from the thinking that cybersecurity is an IT problem to solve to rather seeing cybersecurity as a business risk to manage.
Great, thank you. So turning our attention to the healthcare industry, what are some of the growing trends among hospitals and healthcare systems when it comes to cyber and ransomware attacks?
Yeah, healthcare, I think, really does stand out as one of the top industries that is affected by cybercrime. And when we think about your cyber risk, there's multiple components. Obviously, there's the sophisticated threats of the criminals, but there's also the technology that you bring to the table, right? So emerging tech, digital distribution, and so on. And we've seen a massive shift to connected medical telemetry devices and patient treatment devices. And this just creates a broader threshold through which criminals can attack. And they've also shifted to massive outages, which elicit, orders of magnitude larger types of payments. So we're not talking about several $1,000s in some equivalent of cryptocurrency. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And criminals are good at cultural engineering, which is an evolutionary shift from social engineering, the basics of, looking at LinkedIn to find out who's in the company and who the executives are, or Facebook to find out what your personal interests and favors are. They do a great job of masquerading as industry insiders, as influencers, as your vendors and your employees, which makes it doubly difficult to detect these types of threats. And the reality is, because of the critical nature, the life and death nature of healthcare, they're forced to make these kind of payments. And criminals understand that, and they're going to exploit that vulnerability.
Mark, in your recently released book, talk a little bit about what security leaders can learn from it.
The volume of attacks over the last few years have dramatically increased, but as have the tactics, right? They become bolder, they're more organized, and they're far more pervasive and a lot harder to detect. And most companies suffer through what I call a cycle of false assumptions and a checkbox mentality towards security, right? I meet some kind of compliance standard and therefore I'm safe. Well, those standards were built to make sure that insiders didn't access information to which they were unauthorized. It wasn't designed for criminals who were targeting their organizations and attempting to shut them down. And the reality is, working with hundreds of companies, that most of the ones that I've worked with that have been attacked, these attacks could have been prevented or at least minimized. And the thing is, these companies also suffer in silence, right? The majority of these types of attacks don't make the headlines, which means, unfortunately, it breaks a valuable chain that we can use to vicariously learn as an industry and as a collective. And I realized the best way to get the word out was to tell their stories, the ones that never made the headlines, and not to blame them or to castigate in some way, but to really expose the fundamental causes of cybercrime, to offer new ways of looking at the problem, and to start a conversation to help the business executives and the technical practitioners protect themselves from the next cyber attack.
So when we're looking at detection, what's the difference between finding factors rather than finding fault?
Yeah, so this is certainly a theme that I use in talks day in, day out. The reality is, so many of these breaches, and particularly the ones that we have read about, the headlines, are attributed to a single factor, right? We hear about a web server that wasn't patched properly, or perhaps a cloud service that was misconfigured. The problem is cybersecurity attacks and these massive data breaches are a result of a confluence of factors, not a single point of failure. It's not one human that made a mistake. It's not one machine that wasn't misconfigured. We have to step back and think about it more broadly. So in that case, well, why was that server not updated? Was there not enough staff? Were the staff not trained properly? Did the company not invest in vulnerability and patch management systems that would have automated that and completely eliminated that risk? So the issues go not just from the lowest person in IT, they actually go right to the top of the board. We also bring human biases, things like hindsight, where we think that now that we know the outcome, we could greatly predict it and prevent it. And worse, outcome bias. And that is to say, now that we know what's happened as the result, that we cast blame, right? We blame the CSO, the chief security officer, or some junior IT person because they forgot to patch that system. And we also have a time bias. We look at the last figure or the last element in the chain of events, and that's what we blame. And what we really have to do is step back and understand the complexity and the responsibility. And it's the type of things that other industries, things like medical practices and healthcare, and engineering and architecture, and the aviation and airline industries have all come to know and to embrace to create a cycle of continuous improvement.
Speaking of humans, how do companies go about making humans more cyber aware without creating a big brother atmosphere in their organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of sort of, joking kind of phrases in the IT world for human error, right? PEBCAP, problem exists between the chair and the keyboard. And as I said, it's easy with our biases to kind of blame the individual. But part of the problem is that they don't understand the risk. So they just see this as a bunch of rules, a bunch of bureaucracy that you're dumping on them, limitations, things that make it harder for them to do their job, controls that they sometimes want to go around because of the complexity that you put in place when it comes to doing their day-to-day work. Well, it really helps to tell the stories in a language that they can understand. Tell them as a story. Don't explain what phishing is or what ransomware is. It's not about, giving them a glossary. It's about putting contextual wrappers around it so they suddenly understand how they, as an element in the chain within their organization, can be abused, right, tricked, and so on into, conducting behavior or activities that the criminals want them to. So it's really about cooperation and not coercion. This isn't a name and blame. If you do phishing tests, for an example, and somebody gets hooked, you don't put their name up and you don't force them to go to some kind of lunch and learn, because you're not really in any way installing the kind of behavior that you're looking for. So arm them, give them the tools to protect the business, help them understand why this is critical and understand what they need to be alert for. Because when they become part of your defense, right? They become a tripwire, an early warning where somebody says, I received this suspicious email, and when I went back to the recipient, I didn't get what seems to me to be a legitimate response. And maybe there's other people in the organization. And when you start to see 2 or 3 or 5 or 12, that's where you have to assume that someone on the criminal side is testing the wire. They're trying to find your weak, vulnerable points so that they can get inside your organization, and then they can exploit your business.
So aside from humans, there is a lot of risk that businesses have to track. So how do you recommend that businesses take stock of their risk?
Yeah, so this is where it starts. As I said, right? It's cybersecurity is not an IT problem to solve; it's a business risk to manage. And part of this is understanding the risks that are specific to their business. So seek guidance from cybersecurity experts. And as I said earlier, risk comes in multiple forms. So it's not just the sophisticated threat actors that are targeting your business and using cultural engineering to look like an insider within your industry, but it's also the technology that you choose to adopt. So when you internet connect those medical devices, or you tie your assembly lines in a manufacturing facility to your ERP system to streamline inventory ordering and so on, as I said, you create a larger threshold within an area that those criminals can then exploit. So understand what those look like, and there's lots of sharing information around that. Inventory your obligations. So obligations may be regulatory requirements, compliance standards, but they're also things that you bake into the contracts with your customers, with your employees, your investors, and your vendors. So understand what they look like, determine what the risk looks like, and create a registry. Now that's a slightly more technical activity, but it's a practice of effectively saying, look, these are the top 20 problems that we have that we think are the top things that would be exploited. So we prioritize them, and here's what we're putting in place to fix them. That makes it something that's trackable. And also establish that budget in that program. I gave you an earlier example where I talked about blaming single factors and saying, well, why wasn't that server patched? Well, that's because the board refused to pay the money for automated patch management systems. So think about it in that context, because it is a life cycle and each person has that piece to play.
So let's drill down a little bit more on risk because it is so very important. So looking at specific steps, what specific steps can businesses take to assess their actual risk? And not only that, the potential impact.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it really is the first step that companies need to take. And this needs to start at the top, right? So the boards and the C-suite, the executives, the non-technical practitioners here. And there's lots of different frameworks for this. Our friends across the pond in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Center, they have a board toolkit. Also here, the National Association of Corporate Directors in North America also has a cyber risk handbook that they provide. CISA through the NSA and through Homeland Security also have leadership governance documents. But when you boil them down, there are 5 pillars. The first one we've kind of touched on already, which is awareness, right? So understanding what the business looks like, what are the risks that are associated with the practice that you are in, and understanding what that might look like, what the consequences might look like. I've already touched on this one as well. Obligations, right? So again, this is what are in your contracts, what regulatory guardrails do you have to stay within? Then putting that program together, right? Working collectively to determine what the budgets are and focusing that program to meet the business objectives. What are the highest risks? What are the aspects of the business that must be protected at all means? Those are the things where you want to put the majority of your effort. And then also creating that reporting that closes the loop. So we have our budget, we have our plan, we know what we're aligned to. Well, are we effective day in, day out, right? Are we improving? Are we seeing attacks go up? Are we doing a better job of handling them? Is the time that it takes us to detect them decreasing, which we call dwell time, and is generally a strong indicator of the fact that you will stop something from occurring or before it becomes business disrupting, and that's critical in itself. And then ultimately, incident response, which is the element of planning for the worst, right? So that is putting those plays in place, understanding who's on the team, what their roles and responsibilities are. And it goes, it's soup to nuts, right? It goes right from the technical sides, like how are we going to detect this? How do we contain it? What forensics and information do I have to collect? Right into the business side. So what are my legal obligations? When do I have to notify law enforcement or bring in a regulator? And of course, what all I think executives really, fear and never want to have to do is stand in front of a camera live on the 6 o'clock news explaining what's happened to this major company that they run and having to explain to their constituency, to their investors, to their employees, and to their customers what the negative impact might be. So doing the kind of crisis communications training. At the end of the day, when it happens, right, it is a very difficult, challenging, and stressful environment to be in. But the best you can do is be prepared and hope that the muscle memory kicks in. That's what's going to save you in these events and minimize the business impact.
In your book, you bring up the concept of gray crime. Can you help us understand a bit more of the concept and perhaps give us some examples of gray crimes and data privacy laws?
Things used to be a little more black and white, right? We have our nation, we have enemies of the state. So, the traditional was, the Soviet Union decades ago, but, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, etc. And interestingly now, we don't call them enemies of the state because technically they haven't declared war on us and we haven't declared war on them. So it's more gray. It's a bit like the Cold War back in the Soviet era with, the fear of nuclear strikes. Well, now it's not nuclear strikes and it's not cold. Now it's gray and now it's cyber attacks, attacks on hospitals, on utilities, and so on. And the problem with these types of crimes is that they're harder to detect. Because they stay below the threshold of all-out war and military action, it's harder to take responses and reactions against them. Imagine going to the UN and saying, this country's attacked us and is shutting down some hospitals. We want to drop bombs on them. No one's going to approve that or support that, and allies aren't going to get involved. And they know that. So they're leveling the playing field, and they're equalizing their battle tactics and their abilities in the battlefield. Now we see this kind of, appear in some of the more recent attacks, like attacks on FireEye, that FireEye, I think, was extremely good about coming forward with and doing it very quickly to help as a community so that we could all protect and learn from it. SolarWinds is another one, right? This is a massive vendor kind of strike that led to large leakage in government agencies. So we're going to continue to see these types of attacks. And even some of the older ones we saw, like Equifax, for example, eventually was attributed by the Justice Department to the Chinese army. And I believe 2 or 3 gentlemen from Shenzhou province were actually, charged. Now, I doubt that they're going to show up in, Atlanta to actually be arraigned. But, we're starting to some degree, tie back that attribution of who was the threat actor. And in fact, we've even seen missile strikes and trade wars, the kind of tectonic geopolitical types of events, have aftershocks. And those aftershocks and the consequences of those are felt by smaller mid-market business. And we've actually saw that after the missile strikes in the Middle East at the beginning of 2020, and also after some of the trade wars with China heated up.
So in the end, who do you trust?
I think that's one of the biggest issues that I worry about with gray crime and these gray sort of actors, right? These countries, is that not only are they trying to create economic disruption, but they're creating social, cultural, and political disruption. And we're getting to a point where we don't know what fact is. Fact is now faith. There is no accepted terminology. It's belief, right? And then that belief is, of course, going to fall, depending on however you are socially, culturally aligned. Because of that, it does make it harder to trust. But I do think at the end of the day, there's a few things we need to do, right? In this reality in which we live, what can we do? What can we control? Well, I think SolarWinds was another massive wake-up call when it comes to assessing vendor risk. And when it comes to vendor and partner risk, I talk about the 3 Ps, which is policies, prevention, and promises. Now, these really equate to making sure that you put, as I talked about earlier with risk management, putting the right policies in place, building the team, making sure you have resources to be able to assess a vendor, to make sure that they can meet your standards, putting whatever preventative controls in place that you can. So these are control mechanisms between the vendor, minimum security requirements that contractually you obligate them to. And of course, that leads to the third part, which is the promises. So it's not just the minimal security obligations, but it's things like notifications. So treat yourself like a privacy organization like GDPR or CCPA. When you suspect something, when you think something's going on, pick up the phone and let us know, because that helps us determine whether or not it's actually infected our environment. And it's collaboratively is the only way we can work. It's like I said, it's part of the reason I wanted to write the book, is that when companies suffer in silence, when they don't tell people, the problem is none of the rest of us can learn, and we also can't protect ourselves from this. At the end of the day, the short term that I use is prevent what you can, and prepare for what you can't, right? And the faster you detect it, the faster you contain it, the better off you're going to be. So at the end of the day, you want to build an ecosystem that is contractually bound to do things like stipulate division of duties, so we all know what we're doing. So if I go back to that server that wasn't updated and patched correctly, was that the vendor who installed it? Was that the vendor who built it? Or is that me now as the user and the administrator? Understanding what my obligations are around notification of events, sharing of communication to law enforcement, regulators, et cetera, and then indemnification. So things like cyber insurance. What policies do you need to carry? Again, who's responsible for what? If we have to notify clients, who's paying for that? And who's the one who goes in front of the cameras or writes the letters, et cetera, right? So, ultimately, who can you trust? I don't know, but I think we have to take that notion of zero trust, which is the cybersecurity term of the idea of a user is automatically assumed to be guilty until they can prove themselves innocent through some kind of validation and credentials. I think we still have to start to do the same thing with vendors. It's not to say that vendors are guilty or they're colluding with the criminals. They're not. They're being used by these criminals, and they just don't even know that it's occurring.
Looking ahead, what cybercrime trends do you see in the market? And what should organizations do to get ahead of them now?
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm really worried about here is that I think that the same tactics that we've seen with instability and, in elections and political viewpoints and so on, that type of subtle work through social media that can be used to spread ideology or, as some have argued, to affect the outcome of elections, can also be manipulated or used to manipulate public markets. So a simple example that I would use here is, there's a show called Billions about a large successful hedge fund and their kind of war with the personal and professional war with the attorney general. And it turns out that the hedge fund manager or owner, his enemies have effectively invested in this company, and he hires actors to go out and pretend that they got sick from the food that they were selling, and this occurs as the company goes IPO, which of course completely crashes their value. And those people, including his enemies, the attorney general, who had invested hundreds of millions of dollars, were wiped out. Now, that's a very obvious example. But what happens when it becomes a lot more subtle? What happens when through social media channels, the mainstream ones and some of the secondary ones we're seeing start to emerge, and we start to say, you know what, this company is aligned in a political way that I don't like. Or, perhaps it has nefarious side effects, like there's some toxic element to the food, or, we remember the batteries exploding with electric cars, those kind of things, where you're sort of shifting it into the public realm. You're democratizing misinformation and allowing it to spread. You're the butterfly that beats its wings. They become the hurricane on the other side of the globe. Ultimately affects the value of a company. And if you know what's going to happen on the public markets, if I know that the stock is going to go down on Monday, or I know the stock is going to go up on Monday, I know how to invest. I know to short the stock if it's going down. I know I can go long if it's going to go up, and I can make a lot of money. By the SEC's definition, that is insider trading. I also think we're going to see what I call, or probably an overused term now in sort of science fiction, lexicon, is the ghost in the machine, right? And this is the notion of artificial intelligence and it being, misused and abused. And we've seen this time and time again, where we see AI popping up, to serve good, right? To be able to identify threats, to quickly be able to delineate between false positives and legitimate activities that need investigation. But what happens when you start to poison that AI data? What happens when it intentionally misses things, or it's skewed, or it's used as a weapon, where it starts looking at, all the data that's out there in the criminal world around which attacks worked best, who tends to pay ransoms, what factors led up to higher ransoms being paid out, what insurance companies tend to be the ones that fold faster and simply pay, what companies just completely rebuild and refuse to give a ransom fee. These kind of things, they can start to do this to actually engineer and become more and more effective. And that's slightly terrifying. Or they can run simulation after simulation, millions of simulations, to determine what kind of subtle attacks went undetected by the various defense mechanisms. And I think the last thing that we're going to have to deal with is watching the watchers. It's, as we saw with FireEye, attacks on security vendors, and for two good reasons. First, security vendors, of course, if you can get into that one security vendor and from them infiltrate the client base, it's a one-stop shop, right? You pick up that one vendor, let's say in the legal space, an e-discovery vendor. So I pick them up, I infect them, and I deploy the technology, and now I own 400 law firms and I shut them down. We are now talking about significant industry-wide impact. Or on the security side, what happens when I infect them and I use that to move into their client base? Because again, it's a one-stop shop. I think ultimately, as I said, we're moving into a very gray world. It is going to become more and more difficult. And, I think back to years ago when we worked with some law enforcement, and the FBI at the time said, look, it's the wild, wild west. So, strap on your sidearm and get your rifle, because you're going to have to defend your own ranch, because there is nobody coming, right? The cavalry doesn't exist. And to some degree, you are going to have to take your own defense, your own security, and the longevity of your business into your own hands.
Well, Mark, this has been some terrific insight, and we thank you and appreciate your time today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Stay tuned for more from eSentire in the future.